The girls of Elm Lake High are throwing a party. A slumber party to end all teen massacres. The party starts at 6 minutes and 6 seconds past 6.
Knock, knock, bitch, open up.
Can you believe Barbarian called us the F-slur? Hi, I'm Luna C., Atlanta's horror expert. I am the Swamp Hag of West Georgia, and I'm here today to talk about some queer horror. So I graduated from the University of West Georgia in 2017 with a Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Painting and Illustration. And while I was there, I started taking freeze frames from different 80s slashers and stuff and would recontextualize them into a more queer drag aesthetic and produce these paintings with layers of VHS, lo-fi grittiness on them. And I also produced a short film called The Forces of Faggotry, which was a parody on late night television and also just vintage horror schlock. And I created these two bodies of work basically just to explore the themes of queerness and otherness in horror. So starting back to the earliest horror movies, you have these monsters, like the Universal monsters, who are un-American. They come from faraway, distant lands like Europe, or they are an abomination of God and religion like Frankenstein, or you have the vampire, who are notorious sexual beings that seduce men and women. And then later, towards the 60s, you get sort of your more homebred American killers, but they're usually inverted in some way in terms of their sexuality, their relationships with society. I always think of Norman Bates in Psycho and his relationship with his overbearing mother and his mother side, if you will. Typically, in an 80s slasher, you have a man with a knife, which is always a metaphor for his phallus. But usually, this is not the type of man that we as a society would view as normal. There's typically something wrong in their childhood, their gender expression, their relationship with their family, or they have to conceal some sort of secret other side of themselves that cannot be shown in heteronormative society. I'd say up until maybe the last 10 years, a lot of these films, you really kind of have to dig into the subtext and maybe make a few reaches. But I mean, there are also pretty blatant examples. The one that comes immediately to mind is Nightmare on Elm Street 2, known as the gay Elm Street. I don't know how they slipped that in 1985 and nobody got it up until the late 90s, early 2000s. It was so there, it was so obvious.
What were things about that one that explored or sort of expressed that queerness?
Okay, so instead of having a final girl in that film, you have a final boy named Jesse. Freddy is taking over his body, and he has to repress the urges that Freddy is uncovering within him. knowing a little bit behind the scenes, a lot of the production crew on this film was queer and they got it. So everything they did kind of reinforced that in terms of set dressing, costuming, song choices, things like that, all sort of enhanced it. I mean, even the main character goes to a leather bar at one point in the film. Like, come on. I don't know if any other genre of film explores American society's hang-up with sex more than the horror genre. In the 80s, we get this almost puritanical view of sex, maybe subconsciously informed by the AIDS crisis, but we all think of the trope in 80s horrors, you have sex and you die. In the 90s, that kind of flipped, but I do still think there is some hang-ups with having any sort of sexuality to a character. You can kind of see this in the genre of body horror with films by David Cronenberg, like The Fly, where people's bodies are literally rejecting the norm and rotting and decaying. I think horror has always been on the vanguard of society, and things in society that we're anxious about get to play out in horror, and I think through a healthy catharsis, it pushes our boundaries through film and what we find acceptable on film. And I think that horror has come a long way from the days of Sleepaway Camp, Dress to Kill, Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Butcher Baker, Nightmare Maker. All these films, while we love them because they're so deliciously camp and any representation is better than no representation, they all leave an aftertaste of queer phobia. But without those films, I don't think society would have pushed through to where we are now of having just normal, healthy representation of queer people. I would say specifically in the past 3 years, horror and media in general has just broadened its horizons to really showcase queer and trans representation. I think of films like Fear Street, the trilogy, that was a sapphic slasher, which we don't get a lot of. The new Chucky series has brought in genderqueer characters, offspring of Chucky, if you remember back from Seed of Chucky. India Moore has gone on to be cast in films like The Escape Room 2, just playing a kind of inconsequential character. Angelica Ross was cast in American Horror Story 1984 and has continued to be in that show. So we are really seeing sort of progresses in representation in media, and love it or hate it, without films like Sleepaway Camp shocking people, I don't think we would have gotten there.
Why do you think that is?
Early queer horror films, even if they weren't intentionally so, even if it was just for a shock element, sort of in a metaphorical sense, like ripped off that Band-Aid real fast. And sure, a lot of times it was used as a shocking reveal, something to gross out audiences, but I think moving beyond that initial shock and awe of it, it just seeps in and becomes more commonplace. Drag and horror have always been side by side. I mean, Divine in the late 60s, early 70s. John Waters and Divine were very inspired by films like Night of the Living Dead and Blood Feast. And through their transgressive films, I feel like really kind of married horror and drag together in media for probably the first time. And I feel like Dragula has really opened up the box to performers working out sort of the darker experiences of being queer and showing that it's not always happy, sunshine, gay. Like, we still have such a long way to come, and horror and drag really kind of help push the narrative and how far we move. Horror for me was the first time I saw represented in media that life is not always great. And through the cathartic reaction of horror, riding that roller coaster with your survivor, your characters, I saw power in people overcoming horrifying obstacles, just truly the worst things that you could ever imagine happening in your life. And I think as queer people, we deal with that on a pretty, unfortunately, systematic basis. And we can gain power from both these victims portrayed in horror movies and also these monsters portrayed in horror movies. I think that queer people will always be there for horror. We love a genre that is so deliciously camp, so overly dramatic, and so devastatingly violent towards straight people.
We're going to kill you! Kill, kill, kill!
I just look forward to the future where we get horror films with mostly queer casts. As I said earlier, I really want to see some queer villains. Come on. We all love a good queer Disney villain. Let's get some more up in film, please. And I, lunacy, drag queen extraordinaire, would not be here without my love for just the worst, bottom of the barrel 80s schlock, like trash horror movies. Would not be here at all without any of those. I'm talking like Hack-O-Lantern, Troll 2, Blood Diner, Slumber Party Massacre. Just, they're so great, so fun, so camp, and so drag.
Do you have any final words? Final thoughts?
Queer horror for life and queer horror for death.
Yay!